Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the lantern-lit alleys of an old Korean night market, where steam rises from sizzling pans, vendors shout over one another, and tucked between skewers of grilled fish cakes and stacks of rice cakes you spot something stranger. A row of tall, earthenware jars, their lids slightly askew, releasing faint, sweet, and sour scents into the humid night air. You lean closer, and it's not just food being sold here but forgotten brews, bubbling with invisible life, drinks your ancestors once cherished and maybe even feared. You probably won't survive this. At least not if you tried some of those brews in real life without a modern stomach, because what counted as refreshing centuries ago could very well knock you flat with bacteria or unexpected potency. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I love knowing where in the world you're sipping along with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The jars loom like silent guardians, each one holding a story inside. As you weave through the crowd, your ears catch snippets of old tongues, vendors boasting that their brew could cure headaches, rekindle love, or guarantee a bumper harvest. Your fingers trace the cool rim of one jar, the glaze rough where fire licked it in the kiln. The vendor grins toothlessly and ladles a cloudy liquid into a cracked ceramic cup, pressing it into your hand like an initiation. You raise it, and suddenly you're not just in a market. You're walking straight into centuries of fermented history. The first sip is a whisper, rice softened into a tangy creaminess, faintly sweet, slightly fizzy. It clings to your lips, heavier than modern beer but lighter than wine. Mainstream historians agree that ancient Koreans consumed a wide variety of rice-based ferments, some used in ceremonies, others in daily life, but always tied to rhythm of seasons and ritual. Yet you notice something quirky. In some markets, brewers apparently left wooden sticks inside the jars to stir the yeast, and children would sneak sips through the cracks when no one was watching, a mischievous rite of passage. And historians still argue whether these jars were purely commercial ventures or spiritual offerings disguised as street food, because the line between drinking for joy and drinking for the gods was never entirely clear. The night market hum grows louder as you push deeper. One stall offers a brew laced with honey, thick, golden, and aromatic. Another displays a jar tinted green by herbs, its surface shimmering like moss after rain. Your nose picks up both comfort and warning. Some jars smell invitingly floral, others like wet leather. You think about how, in a world without refrigeration, fermentation wasn't a hobby but survival. Alcohol killed dangerous microbes, stretched the grain harvest, and gave farmers the calories to keep swinging sickles under the scorching sun. You take another sip, and it settles warmly in your chest, a liquid time machine pulling you closer to the forgotten core of Korean life. As you drift, you notice the way people gather around these jars, not just for drinking but for storytelling. Old men argue about the proper amount of millet to add. Women laugh about their neighbor's failed batch, and young lovers exchange shy glances over shared cups. You imagine the ferment not as drink, but as glue, holding a community together in fragile balance. The froth on top of the brew catches the lamplight like a halo, and suddenly the crowd blurs. You're the only one left with your cup, carrying centuries of stories on your tongue. And so you walk further, each jar you pass another doorway, each sip another clue to the forgotten fermented drinks of ancient Korea, your path already set into the winding alleys of memory and myth. The taste of that first cloudy sip still clings to your lips as you drift onward, past the clamoring night market into fields glowing faintly under moonlight. Stalks of rice stretch before you, each plant whispering in the warm summer breeze, and you start realizing that the story of Korea's forgotten ferments begins right here, knee-deep in the flooded paddies. You bend down, letting the muddy water soak your calves, and the air smells of wet earth and young shoots. Life at its simplest, destined to be transformed into something intoxicating. What sets these paddies apart from fields in Japan, you wonder? The Japanese would refine their rice into sake, polished grains stripped of husk and bran, yielding a clear, delicate drink. But here, in Korea, the story bends differently. Instead of chasing clarity, brewers leaned into murkiness, letting the mash stay thick, the flavors richer, the drinks often cloudy enough to chew. Historians often point out that while sake became a ceremonial drink for purity, Korean brews like makgeolli and its older cousins leaned toward sustenance. Calories in a cup, a farmer's second meal. The quirky part: some villagers believed that cloudy drinks carried the spirit of the rice itself, that stripping it clear, like the Japanese did, would offend the crop's guardian deities. So they left the drink rustic, milky, with flecks floating around like ghosts of the field. And historians still argue whether these differences sprang from agricultural necessity, Korean strains of rice being more suited to coarser fermentation, or from cultural symbolism tied to earthiness and honesty. You picture yourself squatting beside a stone mill as a group of women pound rice into flour, the rhythmic thud echoing under the stars. They laugh between strokes, gossiping about neighbors, pausing to sprinkle powdered starter culture, nuruk, over the steaming grains. The air fills with a warm, nutty scent, as if bread dough were about to rise, except this dough would melt into liquid. The women cover the mash with cloth and tuck it away, like putting a baby to bed, whispering short prayers that the gods of fermentation will behave kindly this season. Your hands trace the jars stacked nearby, cool earthenware still damp from river clay. Ongi jars, porous and breathing, alive with unseen bacteria and yeasts waiting for a chance to party. You lean your ear close and swear you can hear faint fizzing inside, carbon dioxide bubbles pushing against the lid, the drink alive in a way bottled beer never is. You wonder if that gentle fizz once startled its first drinker, like sipping the earth's exhale. Night deepens, and in the fields, farmers finish their day's labor. They huddle around a low fire, sharing bowls of freshly brewed drink. The liquid glows pale in the firelight, settling heavy in their bellies, washing away fatigue. A man to your left sighs contentedly. Rice feeds the body, but drink feeds the spirit. His wife smirks, adding, "Or breaks it if you don't stop." Laughter ripples, bowls clink, and in that instant, you glimpse how fermented rice became more than just sustenance. It became punctuation to daily toil, a pause worth savoring. And yet, beyond the laughter, there's reverence. A portion of each batch is always poured back into the fields, a libation to the soil. The drink that nourished humans also nourished the land that bore it. You take another sip, the taste creamier now, earthy, with a faint sour kick like yogurt crossed with champagne. Your tongue tingles, and suddenly you're not just tasting rice. You're tasting the entire ecosystem. Water, soil, sun, hands, breath. You shift on your feet, remembering that in some records, ancient brewers also experimented with millet, barley, even beans mixed into the ferment, each grain adding its own character. Some mixtures turned out so thick they were eaten with spoons rather than drunk. Children slurped watered-down versions, the alcohol mild, the nutrition precious in lean winters. Adults, meanwhile, argued over whose batch tasted strongest, sharpest, or smoothest, just like people today argue over craft beer bitterness. The debate still circles in your head. Was rice chosen for flavor, for ritual symbolism, or just because it was abundant? Historians still argue whether early Korean brews sprang independently from local traditions, or whether they were influenced by neighbors to the east and west. The truth, like the cloudy drink itself, remains murky, and maybe that's the point. Ambiguity can taste just as intoxicating as certainty. Your cup empties, and you look up. Fireflies drift above the paddies, their lights flickering like embers caught in the night. Somewhere, drums echo faintly from a nearby village, calling you onward. The path of forgotten ferments doesn't stop with rice. It spreads like ripples, sweetened with honey, sharpened with herbs, each sip another step deeper into memory. You rise, wiping the mud from your legs, and begin to follow that faint drumming sound, carrying the warmth of rice wine in your chest like a lantern. The drumming grows louder as you leave the rice fields, and soon you stumble into a village square strung with paper lanterns swaying gently in the night breeze. In the center sits a broad wooden table, covered not with food this time, but with jars that gleam golden in the lantern light. Your nose catches it before your eyes confirm it. Thick, sweet, almost floral. Honey. You inch closer, and the air grows syrupy, every breath tinged with the nectar of 1,000 blossoms harvested by bees long dead, but still whispering through this drink. A woman in layered hemp robes ladles out a cup for you, the liquid shining amber, as though someone had melted sunlight and trapped it inside a vessel. You lift it to your lips and sip cautiously. Instantly, your tongue meets sweetness richer than sugar, smoothed by alcohol's faint burn. It coats your throat like silk, leaving behind a perfume of flowers you can't quite name. You close your eyes, and for a moment, the village noise fades. You hear only bees humming in a distant meadow. Honey, after all, was more than sweetener here. It was status. Only those with access to hives or royal favor could afford to waste precious nectar on fermentation. Mainstream history tells you that honey wines, cousins of mead, were brewed for Korea's ruling class and temples, drinks of ritual and indulgence rather than daily survival. But here's the quirky detail. Some brewers mixed honey with medicinal roots, hoping to balance sweetness with healing power. Imagine sipping a golden drink that promised both a tipsy evening and a cure for your aching joints. Convenient marketing, if nothing else. Historians still argue whether these honey brews were imported concepts from China or independent Korean creations born of the peninsula's wildflower abundance. You swirl the cup, noting how thickly it clings to the sides. The vendor whispers that this batch sat in clay for a full year, hidden under the floor of her house, where the earth's steady coolness coaxed the honey into mellow strength. You picture her family sneaking peeks, resisting temptation, counting moons until the first sip could be taken. When that lid finally lifted, it wasn't just drink revealed. It was patience made liquid. Around you, the village festival pulses. Drummers pound away at barrel-shaped instruments, dancers spin in bright hanbok skirts, and young children chase each other with sticky fingers from stolen drops of honey. The drink flows freely, poured into ceramic bowls that catch firelight like treasure. Someone leans in close and jokes that honey brews are the drink of bees. And if you drink enough, you might grow wings. Laughter follows, but you notice a darker truth behind the humor. Honey was so prized that theft of hives sometimes sparked feuds between villages. What glitters in your bowl once carried the weight of conflict. You take another sip, heavier this time, and feel warmth spread down your chest, a soothing heaviness that edges into drowsiness. Sweet drinks always deceive, you think, easy going down, but unforgiving later. Still, in this moment, you imagine a courtly scene. Nobles reclining behind painted screens, servants carrying trays of golden cups, the air thick with perfume and scheming. Honey ferments were not just indulgence but theater. Status displayed in liquid form, a golden badge of privilege. And yet, out here in the village, you see something more humble. Farmers mix smaller amounts of honey into their rice drinks, stretching sweetness across bowls, turning luxury into shared joy. Children smear honey on rice cakes, elders dip their fingers in and declare it medicine. For once, the gulf between classes narrows, sweetness crossing boundaries the way bees cross fields. You remember, too, how honey was thought to connect humans to the divine. In old tales, bees were messengers of heaven, their nectar carrying whispers from gods. To drink honey wine, then, was to taste something sacred. Whether you believe it or not, you can't deny that each sip feels strangely alive, as if light itself is sliding into your veins. The drumming slows. A dancer collapses gracefully, pretending drunkenness, earning cheers. Someone offers you a refill, but you shake your head, feeling the weight of sugar already humming in your blood. You glance at the jars again, lids sealed, shadows deepening under the lanterns. How many recipes like this were lost when beekeeping shifted, when tastes changed, when empires rose and fell? How many golden secrets still lie buried in forgotten cellars? You set the empty cup down and wipe your lips, sticky with sweetness. The night presses closer, warm and heavy, and somewhere in the darkness you hear a different sound. Not drums, but chanting, low and steady, like monks at prayer. You know where the path is leading next. Not to honey, but to herbs, roots, and mystery simmering in the shadows. You tighten your robe, steady yourself, and begin walking toward the glow of temple torches flickering at the edge of the night. The chant draws you in like a current, pulling you away from the honey-lit square and into a narrow mountain path. The air sharpens as you climb. Pine needles crackle underfoot. The night wind carries scents of earth, moss, and something harsher, almost medicinal. Ahead, a row of paper lanterns flickers, marking the edge of a temple compound. The wooden gate creaks as you pass beneath, and suddenly you're inside an enclave where silence feels alive, broken only by the chanting of monks gathered in a dim hall. You drift closer to a low table set near the temple's kitchen. There, a collection of earthen jars sits steaming, lids half open, releasing a brew so strange you instinctively step back. It smells of bitter roots, sharp bark, and an undercurrent of alcohol that prickles your nostrils. The liquid inside glows faintly in the torchlight, tinged green and brown like a forest floor turned into drink. A monk gestures calmly, as if inviting you to sip, and you realize you're standing before one of Korea's forgotten medicinal ferments. Mainstream history notes that monasteries doubled as pharmacies, experimenting with herbs and roots in both food and drink. Ginseng, angelica, licorice root, even tree barks. Monks tossed them into fermentation jars, trusting that alcohol would both preserve and draw out healing essences. But here's the quirky tidbit. In some folk recipes, animal parts slipped in two, antlers, shells, even desiccated lizards, believed to transfer vitality. Imagine raising a bowl of cloudy green liquid and finding a tiny claw staring back at you. Appetizing? Maybe not, but to them, it was medicine. You lift a cup carefully, the brew hot from its slow simmer. The taste is unlike anything you've known, bitter, resinous, tinged with a sweetness that arrives too late to save you. It slides down like liquid forest, leaving behind a burn that feels less like intoxication and more like instruction. Your body doesn't relax. It braces, as though your bones are being scrubbed from the inside. Historians still argue whether these temple brews were meant for true healing, or if they blurred into ritual, half medicine, half offering to unseen spirits. Monks shuffle past you, silent but watchful. You see one pour a ladleful of the brew before a small shrine, the steam curling upward like incense. Another monk carries a bowl to a sickly visitor, who sips grimacing but grateful. You realize that fermentation here wasn't about taste, it was about transformation, about coaxing strength from the hidden corners of nature. The jar wasn't a drink dispenser, it was an alchemical crucible. You step into the kitchen itself, where shelves overflow with roots, herbs tied in bundles, and jars labeled with faded characters. The air is pungent, peppery one moment, earthy the next. A younger monk grins as he grinds ginseng into powder, slipping a pinch into your palm. You chew it hesitantly. Bitter, yes, but with a lingering sweetness that blooms late, like a kindness revealed after suspicion. You imagine how, dissolved in fermenting rice, it might create both nourishment and myth. And myths certainly grew here. Some claimed a sip of ginseng wine could add years to your life. Others whispered it could make you invisible to evil spirits. There's even a story of a monk who brewed a potion, so potent he meditated for 9 days straight without sleep, though more skeptical villagers said he just passed out in the corner. Whatever the truth, these brews became tangled with Korea's folklore, half science, half storytelling. You lean back against a pillar, dizzy not from alcohol, but from the intensity of flavors and promises swirling in your cup. Your modern mind wonders about probiotics, alkaloids, and chemical extractions. Your wandering soul wonders about faith, patience, and the human need to make sense of suffering. Maybe both matter. Maybe the burn in your chest is more than ethanol. It's a reminder that healing has always been as much belief as biology. The chanting slows, replaced by the deep toll of a temple bell. The monks file out, leaving their jars steaming quietly in the corner. You glance at them one last time, lids trembling as if the forest itself were breathing inside. Then you step back into the night, the mountain air cutting clean through your senses. Ahead, you glimpse another glow, not temple fire this time, but palace lanterns, bright and deliberate, promising indulgence, not medicine. You adjust your footing on the rocky path, feeling the aftertaste of bitter herbs linger like a riddle on your tongue, and walk toward the aristocratic world that waits with glittering cups and sharpened smiles. The mountain path slopes downward, and the clean temple air gives way to the earthy, humid scent of a village well. You hear the splash before you see it, buckets clanging against stone, ropes creaking as they're pulled hand over hand. Lanterns glow faintly around the well's edge, where villagers gather in clusters, their chatter punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional sharp scolding of children sneaking too close to the water's edge. You ease closer, and there, tucked behind the well, sit more of those earthen ongi jars. This time smaller, their lids sealed with cloth and tied down with twine. A woman with weathered hands carefully ladles a cloudy drink from one jar into a simple clay bowl. She presses it into the hands of her granddaughter, who giggles before running off to deliver it to the men seated nearby. You watch as they sip, smack their lips, and nod in quiet approval. These are not courtly drinks of gold, nor temple brews of mystery, but the humble ferments of everyday life. Mainstream historians point out that fermentation knowledge in Korea often passed through the household, particularly through women. Recipes weren't written down but spoken, practiced, whispered from grandmother to daughter. And the quirky detail? Some families believed their personal batch was alive, almost like a household spirit that could be angered if neglected. To appease it, women sometimes sang softly as they stirred, as if the yeast enjoyed lullabies. Imagine the intimacy of that, a brew growing stronger beneath a song only it would ever hear. You crouch beside one of the jars, pressing your hand to the side. It's faintly warm, the ferment alive, exhaling gas into the cloth cover. Someone removes the lid for you, and a burst of aroma escapes, tangy, nutty, with a faint sweetness underneath. You're handed a bowl, the surface frothy and uneven. One sip, and you taste the village itself, grainy, rustic, nourishing, not refined but reassuring. It's the kind of drink you can imagine after hours bent over in the fields, your throat parched and your muscles crying for relief. Historians still argue whether these household ferments were primarily about nutrition or intoxication. Were they made because alcohol was enjoyable, or because it was safer than water, denser than broth, and sustaining enough to count as a meal? The line blurs quickly, especially as you see the villagers treat the drink not as luxury, but as necessity. For farmers, the drink was fuel. For the elderly, it was medicine. For children watered down, it was introduction, a training sip toward adulthood. At the well, the drink also carried ritual meaning. When a jar was opened for the first time, a small portion was poured back into the well, as if to repay the water that gave life to both grain and ferment. The splash echoes now, mingling with the laughter of children, and you feel the gesture more than understand it. A quiet cycle of giving and taking, honoring balance. One old man beckons you closer, his smile wide despite missing teeth. He tells you in a half-whisper that when his grandmother brewed a new batch, she would leave a tiny bowl by the window overnight, so wandering spirits could have their share. If the bowl was empty by morning, it meant the batch would ferment strong. If untouched, she would worry the drink would turn sour. You take another sip, half expecting some invisible guest to snatch the bowl from your hand. Nearby, the women gather to stir another jar. Their wooden paddles move slowly, rhythmically, and you realize the work is not frantic but meditative, part of their daily rhythm. The children peek over shoulders, already learning without realizing. This knowledge doesn't belong to scholars or kings. It belongs to families, to the everyday pulse of village life. The drink is less recipe than ritual, less product than practice. You lean against the stone well, the coolness seeping through your back, and gaze up at the night sky. Stars scatter across the dark like grains spilled on black cloth. For a moment, you wonder how many thousands of nights villagers like this one have gathered around a jar, passing bowls, swapping stories, toasting both joy and sorrow. You sip again, and the froth clings to your upper lip, drawing laughter from the children who point at you as though you've sprouted a beard. It strikes you. In this circle of stone, water, and clay, the drink becomes more than sustenance. It becomes memory. Each family batch of fingerprint, slightly different, slightly unpredictable, yet unmistakably part of a larger tradition. The jars hum softly in your imagination, like patient witnesses to centuries of whispered songs, children's laughter, and late-night confessions. The laughter at the well fades as the night deepens. You finish your bowl, set it on the stone rim, and watch as the villagers begin covering their jars for the night. The lids tighten, ropes are knotted, and the jars are carried carefully back into homes where they'll rest until tomorrow. You take one last look at the well, dark, bottomless, quietly sacred, and then rise to your feet. Ahead, at the edge of the village, more jars gleam faintly in the moonlight, larger and rougher, waiting to tell you their secrets about the magic of clay itself. The village fades behind you, and the night path opens into a courtyard where rows upon rows of enormous clay vessels stand like silent giants. Their round bellies glisten faintly under the moonlight, each one capped with a flat lid that looks too delicate to guard such mystery. You step closer and realize these are no ordinary storage pots. These are ongi, the living lungs of Korean fermentation. You crouch, tracing your fingers over the rough surface. The clay feels porous, almost sandy, and your mind catches on the detail. These jars actually breathe. Tiny air pockets left during firing allow gases to escape, letting ferments bubble without bursting. Unlike sealed glass, ongi jars form a collaboration with the environment, cooling during the day, exhaling at night, alive in ways metal tanks never could be. Mainstream historians agree that this innovation was crucial, shaping not only drinks but also kimchi, soy sauce, and pastes that still define Korean cuisine today. But here's the quirky detail. In some regions, families believed each ongi jar had its own personality. One might be kind, always producing a smooth brew. Another might be stubborn, refusing to ferment properly no matter what was put inside. Some households even named their jars, treating them like family members, and when a jar cracked or shattered, they mourned it with quiet ceremony. You imagine naming the vessel at your feet something like Old Steamer or Breath of Night. Somehow it feels right. You lift a lid and a puff of warm, yeasty air escapes. Inside, a cloudy liquid churns softly, bubbles breaking on the surface. You lean closer and swear you can hear faint fizzing, like a distant fireworks show in miniature. Your nose prickles, nutty, sour, and slightly floral all at once. Someone nearby chuckles at your fascination, remarking that these jars sometimes sing at night, tiny pops echoing like ghostly whispers. You decide that might not just be poetry. It could be the sound of fermentation itself, life busy at work in the dark. Historians still argue whether the design of ongi jars developed independently on the peninsula or was influenced by similar vessels in China and Central Asia. The truth is murky, much like the drinks they birthed. But one fact remains. The jars became uniquely Korean, perfected through generations of potters who understood that thickness, shape, and even lid design changed the flavor outcome. Too tight a lid, and the brew soured. Too loose, and insects intruded. Perfection was a balancing act, one that only experience taught. You wander deeper into the courtyard, past jar after jar, their shadows round and solemn. Moonlight glances off ridges left by potters' fingers, frozen forever in clay. You imagine the countless hands that molded these, spinning wheels by day and stoking kilns by night, never knowing their humble work would hold centuries of history. Someone offers you a bowl freshly dipped from one of the jars. You lift it, and the taste hits you differently this time. Lighter, almost sparkling, as though the jar itself had gifted it freshness. It's not just the ingredients that shape the drink. You realize it's the vessel. Glass could never do this. Plastic would kill it. Only clay, breathing gently with the earth, could coax such balance. The bowl warms your palm, and you pause, staring at the liquid froth swirling lazily inside. How many families had leaned over jars like these, waiting anxiously to see if the ferment succeeded? How many whispered hopes were sealed under these lids. The jar at your feet suddenly feels less like an object and more like a quiet witness, holding not just drink but prayers, secrets, and failures too. A potter appears, his hands still streaked with dried clay, and he pats one jar affectionately. He tells you that when he shapes an ongi, he leaves small intentional imperfections, because perfection traps air, while flaws allow breath. You blink, realizing that what we call flaw might actually be survival. Maybe people, like jars, are meant to breathe through their cracks. The night grows colder, but the jars seem to radiate warmth, as though they store not just drink but memory itself. You place the empty bowl on a lid and glance toward the forested slopes beyond the courtyard. Through the trees, you glimpse faint torchlight, another gathering, this time quieter, more deliberate. The path points toward temples again, but not the herbal mysteries you left behind. This time, the destination promises monks, silence, and brewing as devotion itself. You tighten your robe, letting the last taste of clay-born drink linger on your tongue, and step away from the breathing jars. Behind you, they stand unmoving yet alive, guardians of a fermentation tradition older than memory, their shadows long in the moonlight as if bowing you onward. The torchlight you glimpsed beyond the trees beckons you closer, and soon the sound of chanting returns. Low, steady, woven with the hush of wind through pines. You climb stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet and emerge into a temple courtyard. No festival noise here, no drunken laughter, just stillness, punctuated by the faint gurgle of liquid fermenting somewhere out of sight. You follow your nose. It leads you to a modest shed tucked behind the main hall, where rows of ongi jars sit under the watchful gaze of carved wooden Buddhas. The lids are carefully aligned, not a single one askew. You approach, and a monk in simple gray robes appears, bowing gently before gesturing to one of the jars. He lifts the lid just enough for steam to curl out, and there it is again. That peculiar scent of rice, yeast, and something intangible, patience perhaps. Mainstream history reminds you that Buddhist monks in Korea were not only guardians of philosophy, but also keepers of agricultural and culinary knowledge. They brewed drinks for rituals, for offerings, and sometimes quietly, for their own sustenance during long winters. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some monks swore that chanting mantras while stirring the mash improved fermentation, claiming the sound itself calmed the yeast. Picture a circle of solemn men humming while gently paddling a bubbling jar. It's almost comical, yet strangely believable. Historians still argue whether these temple brews leaned more towards spiritual symbolism or practical nutrition, because both seem equally true. You accept a wooden bowl from the monk, who nods without speaking. The liquid inside is warm and faintly cloudy, thinner than the village brews, but softer than the herbal concoctions you tasted earlier. One sip, and it feels like silence made drink, mildly sweet, faintly sour, and comforting in a way that doesn't push you toward intoxication but toward calm. Your shoulders loosen, your breathing slows, and you realize this wasn't meant to fuel dances or battles. It was meant to sustain meditation. In the dim light, you notice scrolls pinned to the shed's beams. They're covered with lists of ingredients: rice, millet, mountain herbs, even pine needles. The recipes vary slightly, as if each monk added his own subtle interpretation. Yet all are bound by a discipline. Measurements precise, timing strict, lids opened only at certain phases of the moon. Brewing here wasn't guesswork. It was ritual, a reflection of the order monks sought in all aspects of life. The monk who handed you the bowl sits nearby, eyes half closed. He doesn't drink from his own cup, only inhales the steam rising from it, as if intoxication isn't the point at all. Maybe it never was. Maybe the act of brewing, the tending of jars, was the meditation. The drink itself just a byproduct, like a bell's echo after it's struck. You take another sip, heavier this time, and find a faint sparkle, a tickle on your tongue that feels playful, almost mischievous. For a second, you imagine the yeast itself laughing at the solemnity of monks who thought they could tame it. Even here, in the most disciplined space, fermentation still keeps its wild heart. A memory stirs. In some old tales, monks secretly traded their surplus brews with nearby villagers, disguising it as medicine or sacred offering. Some whispered that certain monasteries produced ferments so delicious they rivaled royal brews, though of course no monk would ever admit such a thing. The truth, historians still argue, but the thought makes you grin into your cup. The temple bell tolls, deep and resonant. The monks file into the hall, their footsteps soft, their bowls set aside. You sit in the courtyard alone, surrounded by jars that seem to breathe with the rhythm of your own chest. The air grows colder, but the warmth of the brew lingers, not heavy like wine or sharp like spirits, but gentle, like a friend's hand on your shoulder. You set the empty bowl down, bow slightly toward the rows of jars, and rise. Beyond the temple walls, another glow spreads, a different kind of light, brighter, busier. It's the light of courts and palaces, where silk-robed aristocrats sip in secrecy while plotting under painted screens. The path leads you away from silence and into intrigue, where the drinks may glitter, but the stakes grow sharper. The stone path beneath your feet slopes downward, and with every step the hush of the temple fades. In its place, the air thickens with perfume, candle wax, and the faint sound of music carried on the wind. By the time you reach the gates, you're staring at carved wood panels so intricate they look alive. Dragons winding around lotus blossoms, phoenixes caught mid-flight. These doors don't welcome the common drinker. They guard a realm where fermented drinks become weapons, symbols, and whispered currencies of power. Inside, the palace feels like another world entirely. The silence of monks gives way to silk rustling, paper screens sliding open, and courtiers bowing with exaggerated grace. In a lacquered hall lit by dozens of oil lamps, a group of aristocrats reclines behind low tables. They raise small, delicate cups filled with translucent liquids, each one shimmering in the flickering light like captured moonlight. You glance into a nearby jar and see how carefully brewed the drink must have been. Strained of all cloudiness, infused with subtle ingredients to please a refined tongue. Mainstream history records how Korean courts during the Goryeo and Joseon dynasties guarded brewing recipes as tightly as state secrets. Certain drinks, clearer, smoother, stronger, were crafted solely for royal banquets and diplomatic receptions. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some courtiers allegedly spiked their rivals' drinks not with poison but with social sabotage brews. Ferments so foul-smelling that embarrassment alone ruined reputations. Imagine sitting in silken splendor, only to choke on something resembling fermented fish guts while your enemy smirked politely across the room. Historians still argue whether such tales were political satire or actual dirty tricks, but either way, you find yourself smothering a laugh. One official gestures for you to sit, and a servant pours you a cup no bigger than a thimble. The aroma hits first, floral, with a whisper of honey. You sip, and the flavor unfolds slowly, layers of sweetness, a dry edge, and finally a lingering warmth that spreads like gossip in a crowded hall. It's not the blunt, hearty fuel of farmers or the meditative calm of monks. This is elegance distilled, a drink meant to impress, to flatter, to distract. As you cradle the cup, you overhear murmurs behind a painted screen. Two courtiers lean in close, voices sharp but hushed. They're not discussing philosophy or poetry, but marriage alliances, troop movements, trade deals. The drink in their hands isn't just refreshment, it's camouflage. The sparkling liquid masks schemes the way silk sleeves hide dagger scars. Your host leans toward you, and with a sly grin, mentions how certain brews were reserved for specific court ranks. Only those of high enough station could touch the jade dew, a prized rice liquor believed to strengthen body and mind. Lower officials, no matter their thirst, could only dream. And so every poured cup reinforced hierarchy, reminding you exactly where you stood. The irony? Even as officials sipped with dainty precision, accidents happened. A scholar's diary once described an entire evening ruined when the royal brewer misjudged the timing, producing a brew so sour the king himself spat it onto the floor. A disaster, yes, but also proof that even perfectionists of the court couldn't fully control fermentation's wild streak. The music swells, soft zither, a wooden flute, and dancers in flowing hanbok glide across polished floors, their movements as measured as the servants pouring drinks. You watch the courtiers' faces, some glowing with pleasure, others masking disdain, still others plotting their next toast like generals planning ambushes. Here, alcohol doesn't merely loosen tongues. It tightens knots of politics, weaving invisible webs across the hall. You drain your cup, and the warmth seeps into your limbs, heavier this time. For a moment you almost forget the careful choreography of intrigue, lulled instead by the golden glow of lamps and the surreal stillness of painted cranes on the screens. But outside, the night is alive with drumming and laughter. Beyond the palace gates lies a world where drinks aren't whispered politics but roaring celebration, where jars crack open to fuel dances that last until sunrise. You rise quietly, slipping past servants and courtiers lost in their schemes. The palace fades behind you, its lights shrinking to pinpricks. Ahead, the sound of drums grows louder, faster, inviting. The harvest has been gathered, the people are ready, and the ferments are flowing freely. You follow the music, your feet quickening with anticipation for the frenzy that awaits. The beat of the drums pulls you forward like a heartbeat that doesn't belong to your chest. You crest a small rise and suddenly see them. Villagers gathered in a wide, open field under lanterns strung from tall poles. The harvest is done, wagons loaded with rice and millet stacked neatly at the edge, and now the people are free to stomp, shout, sing, and drink. A bonfire blazes at the center, sparks spiraling into the black sky. Around it, huge ongi jars line up like soldiers, their lids already removed, froth bubbling just high enough to threaten a spill. Servants ladle the cloudy liquid into earthen bowls, passing them hand to hand. You're pulled into the crowd before you even have a chance to hesitate, a warm bowl shoved into your fingers. The liquid sloshes dangerously close to the rim, and you can feel the faint fizz against your skin. One sip, and you're jolted. It's lively, sour-sweet, almost effervescent, a far cry from the polished palace drink. This one doesn't whisper, it shouts. It carries the raw energy of fresh grain, brewed not for subtlety but for fuel, for stamina, for celebration. Mainstream historians agree that such festival brews were thick, cloudy, and nutritious enough to double as food, sustaining entire communities through nights of dancing. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some villagers believed the first ladle had to be offered to the fire, poured straight into the flames to feed ancestral spirits before anyone dared drink. Skip the ritual, and you risk drunken chaos turning into misfortune, crops failing, families falling ill. Historians still argue whether this fire offering was a consistent custom or a patchwork of local traditions. But tonight, you watch the flames hiss as someone tips a bowl into them, and you can't help feeling a little relieved. The drumming intensifies, bodies swaying in concentric circles. Women in brightly patterned hanbok clap their hands. Men stomp their feet. Children squeal as they chase each other between legs and jars. You drink again, heavier this time, and warmth rushes to your cheeks. The brew doesn't lull like the monks drink, nor does it dazzle like the courtiers. It surges, urging you to move, to shout, to join the frenzy. At one edge of the field, an old woman sits with a small group, teaching them the words to a harvest song. Her bowl sits untouched, foam trembling at the rim, but her voice carries through the din. You lean in and catch fragments. Praise for the earth, thanks for the rain, a sly joke about neighbors who borrow tools and never return them. Songs like these, historians say, were as important as the brew itself, both binding communities together, both fermenting memory into something stronger. Your bowl is refilled before you realize it, and this time the liquid tastes slightly different, sweeter, thicker, as if another jar offered its own personality. That's the thing with festival brews. No two jars were the same. A little more rice here, a bit less water there, maybe a stray herb dropped in by a distracted brewer. Each sip became a gamble, and each gamble was part of the fun. The fire crackles, shadows leap across faces, and you find yourself laughing without knowing why. Maybe it's the yeast, maybe the drums, maybe the way strangers slap your shoulder like you've known them for years. For once, the drink isn't about politics or meditation. It's about release. Every worry, taxes, cold winters, stern officials, melts away in the froth. Yet not everyone approves. A gray-bearded man mutters nearby, complaining that too much drinking leads to too much fighting, too many broken promises the next morning. His warning gets lost under the roar of another round of drumming, and you think, he's probably right. But then again, what's a harvest without a little chaos? Historians still argue whether these festivals strengthen villages or weaken them through excess, and you can see both truths flickering in the firelight. Your bowl empties once more, and you tip your head back, staring at the stars. They seem brighter, sharper, as if the universe itself were leaning closer to join the dance. A boy darts past carrying a torch, laughing, and suddenly the whole crowd surges into a new rhythm, faster, louder, almost delirious. The jars foam over, hands clap until palms sting, and for a heartbeat, you feel like you're not just witnessing history, you're living it. But as dawn teases the horizon, the fire collapses inward, the drums slow, and laughter dissolves into yawns. Villagers stagger home, leaning on each other, bowls forgotten in the grass. The jars stand empty, silent, their wild froth spent. You too feel the weight of exhaustion, though not unhappily. Tomorrow, everyone will rise, return to labor, and the brews will vanish until the next harvest. Tonight, though, you've glimpsed the purest form of fermented joy. A drink that didn't just fill bellies, but filled lives. And now, beyond the smoke and trampled grass, another path waits, one darker, heavier. It leads toward camps where drums are replaced by marching feet, and where fermented brews serve not joy, but survival. The echo of drums lingers in your ears as you leave the trampled fields behind. The faint glow of dawn is swallowed by smoke, not festival bonfires now, but the acrid haze of campfires clustered near rows of tents. The laughter of villagers fades, replaced by the clatter of weapons, the creak of leather straps, the weary coughs of soldiers stirring awake. You realize you've stepped into a military encampment, and the scent here is no less fermented, though it carries a harsher edge, like survival brewed in clay. A soldier, bleary-eyed and broad-shouldered, lifts a small jug to his lips and offers it to you without hesitation. You take it, feeling the rough texture of the vessel, and sniff before daring a sip. The liquid inside is sharp, almost vinegary, with a faint sweetness struggling to hold on beneath its bite. It's not the joyous froth of a harvest brew. It's liquid armor, designed to disinfect wounds, steady hands, and grant courage when the drumbeat of battle grows too loud. Mainstream history records that Korean soldiers often carried fermented drinks during campaigns, not as luxuries, but as practical necessities. The mild alcohol sterilized water, warded off illness, and sometimes dulled the pain of injury when medicine was scarce. Yet here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest commanders distributed extra-strong ferments before battle, believing the bravado it sparked outweighed the risk of sloppy sword swings. Imagine an entire unit charging forward, half fueled by adrenaline, half fueled by fermented millet. It's both terrifying and a little absurd. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread strategy or just occasional desperation. You sip again, and the burn crawls down your throat, leaving your chest warm in the chilly dawn. Around you, men stretch, polish weapons, or huddle over bowls, their breaths fogging in the air. Some smear the liquid directly on cuts, wincing at the sting but trusting its cleansing bite more than stagnant water. One soldier shows you how he soaks cloth in the brew before binding it to a wound, muttering that it chases rot away. Nearby, a small group sits cross-legged, passing a stronger concoction from hand to hand. Their laughter is quieter, their voices tinged with both defiance and fear. One jokes about drinking enough to forget the arrows, another teases him for confusing bravery with stupidity. Yet in their eyes, you see the truth. This isn't about celebration. It's about finding courage where none naturally exists. A commander strides through the camp, stern-faced, inspecting both soldiers and supplies. He pauses at a jar, dips a ladle, and takes a measured sip before nodding in approval. For him, the brew isn't indulgence but control. He needs his men sharp, not stumbling. He knows one jar too many could turn victory into disaster. His eyes linger on you, and for a moment you feel judged, but then he moves on, barking orders about formation and rations. The morning brightens, and with it comes the sound of practice drills. Wooden clacks of spears, the hiss of arrows loosed into straw targets, the thud of shields meeting blows. Even here, the jars sit nearby, half hidden but never absent. Soldiers glance at them like old friends, knowing those cloudy liquids will be waiting when night falls, whether to soothe nerves or to toast the ones who didn't return. A memory drifts in. A scholar once claimed that certain battlefield brews included garlic or chili, believed to heat the body and strengthen resolve. Was it science? Was it superstition? Historians still argue, but you imagine a soldier grimacing at the fiery taste, convincing himself he's been made invincible. Sometimes belief itself is the strongest weapon. As dusk approaches, you join the soldiers around their fires. The brew flows again, but softer this time, less about courage and more about comfort. They hum songs of home, voices low and rough, bowls cradled like small shields against despair. One young man stares into the flames, murmuring about his family's rice fields, about the jars his mother used to guard. He drinks slowly, each sip pulling him closer to memory than to intoxication. You set your bowl down, heavy with the weight of what you've seen. In the village, fermentation was joy, in the temple, meditation, in the court, manipulation. But here, in the mud and smoke of war, it's survival, nothing more, nothing less. The jars don't sparkle, they endure, just as the men endure, one sip at a time. And beyond the camp, another horizon glimmers, not the firelight of soldiers, nor the lamplight of courtiers, but the polished glow of foreign visitors. Diplomats, traders, and envoys approach, ready to sip what they don't understand, to judge a culture through a single cloudy cup. You rise, the jug still warm in your hand, and head toward their gathering. The soldiers' camp fades into smoke behind you, and the path ahead grows strangely formal. The dirt road is swept clean, lanterns line the way, and the hum of foreign voices drifts toward you. Soon, you step into a courtyard set with polished tables and silk banners. And there they are, envoys from distant lands, their robes embroidered with dragons and cranes, their brows furrowed as they peer into bowls of cloudy liquid. They lift the cups with care, as though holding something dangerous. One dips his nose to sniff, recoiling slightly at the sour-sweet aroma, then forces a polite smile. Another takes the tiniest sip possible, his lips barely brushing the surface. You suppress a laugh. To you, this is the familiar perfume of rice and yeast, but to them it must feel like drinking from a potion bottle. Mainstream history tells you that Chinese diplomats, Mongol emissaries, and even Japanese officials sometimes encountered Korea's fermented drinks during exchanges. They were used in rituals of welcome, offered as gestures of hospitality that couldn't be refused. But here's the quirky tidbit. Records describe envoys struggling to finish their cups, disguising grimaces behind long sleeves, and sometimes even sneaking sips into potted plants nearby. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles only to be ambushed by a bowl of fermented millet. It's the kind of ordeal no treaty ever prepared them for. Historians still argue whether these encounters strengthened respect or deepened the sense of cultural difference. But tonight you watch the strained faces and suspect it was a little of both. A Korean host raises his cup proudly, urging the visitors to drink deeper. His own bowl is wide, his gulps generous, his smile wide as foam clings to his lips. The foreigners hesitate, then force down more than they intended. One coughs delicately into his sleeve, another fans his flushed cheeks. Still, none dare refuse. In this moment, the cloudy brew is more than alcohol. It's a test, a silent negotiation where tolerance equals diplomacy. You're offered a bowl as well, this one clearer than the festival drinks, yet not as refined as the courtly versions. It sits in between, crafted to impress outsiders without losing its rustic soul. You sip, and the taste blooms sharp at first, then mellows, finishing with a grainy sweetness that lingers. It feels honest, a compromise between elegance and earth. Across the table, a scholar scribbles notes on a scroll, eyes darting between the envoys and the jars. You catch fragments of his writing, cloudy sour, nourishing uncertain effect on digestion. He pauses, frowns, then writes again. Perhaps centuries later, his words will be quoted as evidence that Korea's brews were too wild for foreign tongues. Yet here, in the moment, it's not about digestion at all. It's about pride. One envoy raises a question through an interpreter, asking why the drink is left cloudy instead of filtered. The host chuckles softly, replying that clarity is for courtiers, not for the earth itself. This drink carries the grain whole, unashamed, a reminder of the harvest and the soil. The envoy nods, though his eyes betray his discomfort. You can almost hear his inner thought. Yes, but could we have just a little less grain next time? Still, as the evening stretches, their stiffness loosens. The brew does its work, slowing words, softening tones, drawing laughter where there was only formality before. One diplomat even slaps the table, cheeks flushed, as he attempts a Korean toast and mispronounces half the words, much to the crowd's delight. By the third bowl, their grimaces have turned to cautious smiles. By the fifth, they're leaning on one another, the sourness forgotten. Yet in the corner, one envoy sits apart, barely touching his drink. His eyes remain cold, calculating, as though he sees through the froth to the strategy beneath. For him, this isn't hospitality. It's a reminder that even in a cup, culture can divide as easily as it unites. Historians still argue whether such moments fostered alliances or seeded mistrust, and watching him, you understand why. The night winds down, lanterns sputtering low. The envoys retire, some giggling, some grimacing, their robes trailing through spilled foam. The hosts bow, their smiles satisfied. And you're left with the taste of a drink caught between worlds, welcoming and challenging, familiar and strange. As silence settles over the courtyard, you catch sight of the sea shimmering faintly beyond the gates. Ships bob in the harbor, sails furled, their decks lined with jars secured in ropes. Out there, beyond the waves, another kind of brewing awaits, fermentation carried by salt air and restless tides. You rise, bowl in hand, and follow the path toward the shore. You follow the cry of gulls and the tang of brine to a harbor where lanterns bob on masts like sleepy stars. The docks smell of tar, wet rope, and a yeast-sweet tang that pairs oddly with the salt. Fishermen and coastal traders haggle over fish and spices, but tucked between crates you spot ongi jars, their necks wrapped in oilskin and ropes knotted tight so they won't roll when the sea grows angry. A tar-streaked man grins and clasps your shoulder, saying, in a voice that has eaten too many storms, "Those jars keep better than bread at sea." You climb a gangplank onto a creaky vessel whose boards protest underfoot. The captain, sun-browned, scarred, indignant in a way you learn to trust, shows you his stash, ongi propped in corners, cushioned by straw, labeled in charcoal for which household or hold they belong to. Mainstream maritime records note that sailors along East Asian routes carried rice wine, pickled grains, and preserved fish aboard long voyages. Jars were practical stores of calories and safer than questionable well water. The captain shrugs as if that explains everything, and in a way it does. Necessity is a stern teacher. You discover quickly that superstition and craft ride the same waves. The captain swears by setting a handful of jars on deck during rough weather. The constant, relentless rocking, he claims, seasons the brew and softens its edges. A deckhand tells a more peculiar story. Fog did its work once. What woke in the morning was clearer than when we closed it. An elder sailor swears that leaving a jar under moonlight in calm seas yields a softer, medicinal note. You laugh, but when you sip later you notice small differences and wonder whether sailors' lore sometimes nodded toward microclimate truths. Historians still argue whether these were charming sailors' lore or early, accidental observations about fermentation influenced by seaborne conditions. Below decks the air grows warm and dense with grain dust, tar, and the faint perfume of kelp. The jars huddle between sacks of millet and coils of rope. In that tight, breathing space, the yeast seems oddly content. When the hull rolls, a low vibration travels through the clay, and you can feel it under your palm. A physical heartbeat, tidal rather than human. A deckhand ladles a cup and presses it into your hand without ceremony. The first sip is a surprise, a mineral brightness, a briny whisper beneath rice sweetness, a hint of smoke like a distant kiln. It is ocean braided with harvest, an odd but honest marriage. You notice rituals emerge, as if by instinct. The crew names a favorite jar Old Hollow, and pats its belly like a friend. Before a storm, they tap necks twice and pass the mug around. A child born ashore receives a pinch of steamed rice sprinkled on the rim as blessing. These little rites anchor life at sea. The jars become repositories of memory and solidarity. When a batch sours, you feel the mood change. The men get quieter, eyes fixed on a horizon they imagine as bargaining against fate. Cross-contamination produces improbable flavors. A jar stored near salted mackerel will invite a whisper of umami into its character. A container that sat next to bundles of pine crates can pick up a resinous backnote. Inland envoys who lift a bowl expecting delicate rice often recoil, blink, and then take a second sip. You read merchants' scratchy ledger notes later. Cloudy, fishy, oddly fortifying. And you grin imagining trained palates trying to reconcile their taste with the sea's blunt honesty. The sailors call such complexity the sea's signature. You begin to agree. Practical knowledge proliferates, and you collect it like a small, useful map. A veteran shows you how to stow jars. Base cushioned in straw, neck lashed to a stable spar, wedged where the roll is gentlest. Another trick, controversial but used, is adding a measured splash of seawater at a defined point in fermentation. A little salt nudges yeast and bacteria differently, adjusting osmotic pressure and nudging new aromas. Crude ocean terroir, the captain jokes. You later meet modern artisans who attempt to replicate such techniques in labs and small breweries, curious about the microbiological consequences of a seafarer's intuition. At night, the deck becomes a low stage of storytelling. Lantern light pools, faces roughened by wind, and the single mug makes its slow rounds. One sailor hums an old tune that mentions a jar by name. Others answer with a chorus of slurred harmony. The songs function like recipe books, ingredients and instructions woven into melody, so they survive even when formal logs vanish. You realize you are not merely tasting. You are participating in a living archive where flavor and memory co-author one another. Some jars earn reputations. The crew tells of Bluemouth, a container that reputedly survived 3 typhoons, yet still produced balanced cups. They refused to sell it. When it finally retired, they performed a small ritual. A last bowl poured into the sea, a murmur of thanks. You pour too, feeling slightly absurd and unexpectedly reverent. Human beings, you understand, honor what sustains them. There is danger here, too. Storms shatter pottery, spilling months of provisions into the bilge. Cracked jars flood holds with staleness and waste. Adulterated batches sometimes sicken crews. Captains speak of tossing suspicious containers into the surf, an act of sanitation, sorrow, and superstitious cleansing. Pirates prize jars as readily as coin. A plundered ferment can sap morale quicker than a lost sail. You hear of captains hiding their best containers in false-bottomed chests, or burying them in sandy coves until safe. When the ship makes port, the jars become currency, gift, and diplomacy. You watch sailors barter half-full containers for rice, offer spiced ferments to a monk for salves, or hand a prize jar to an official to smooth passage. Those exchanges ferry maritime flavors inland. A village brewer borrows a smoked salt note. A merchant slips pine resin hints onto a palace menu. Historians still argue whether maritime fermentation altered mainstream tastes or was a niche curiosity. Yet standing on the quay with sea spray drying on your sleeve, you feel the tug of that argument in the slow layering of flavors around you. You slip into a quayside tavern where rafters drip brine and sailors' graffiti tattoos the walls. The innkeeper pours from a jar rimed with tiny salt crystals like barnacles. The first swallow gifts cured fish, kiln smoke, and a bright thread of sweet rice, and you savor how memory and geography compress into a single bowl. Around you, weather-beaten faces debate which port yields the best preserving spice. A young brewer scribbles notes, eyes bright with plans to coax maritime nuance into city cups. Innovation can backfire. You hear a cautionary tale. A captain accepted a miracle spice from a foreign merchant. It masked microbial bloom for a time, but later several men fell ill. Curiosity, tempered by hard-earned respect for tradition, keeps sailors cautious. Still, in cities today a few brewers flirt with C.H. Macchiali, kelp-infused, slightly salted, sometimes gently rocked, to market the romance of spray and barter. What began as a sailor's survival hack becomes a culinary experiment and occasionally an urban trend. Before you leave, you think of microbes, those tiny architects of flavor. In modern terms, the jars you tasted hosted communities of yeasts and lactobacilli adapted to salt, smoke, and movement. Researchers now isolate coastal strains and wonder whether ancient maritime practices cultivated resilient microbes that later bled into inland brews. In your mouth, those microbes translate into memory, a briny high note, a slow souring finish, a maritime fingerprint that lingers longer than the voyage. Dawn softens the horizon as you step ashore. The quay wakes, boys chase gulls, women call across crates, and jars are loaded for new journeys. You tuck the ship's taste into your pocket of experience, the briny, smoky, odd-sweet impression that feels less like novelty and more like another dialect in a long fermenting conversation. The sea has lent a salted stanza to the chorus of Korean ferments, and you hum it quietly as you walk toward wells, temples, and the next jar that will teach you something new about how people turn grain into story. You leave the sea behind, yet echoes of salt linger on your tongue. Inland again, you find yourself climbing a mountain road that narrows to a ribbon between granite cliffs and pine forest. The air thins, crisp and cold, filled with resin and distant bird call. Farmers here carry jars on their backs, bound by woven straps that creak with weight. Ongi looks out of place against alpine rock, but its bellies pulse with the same hidden heat, whispering that microbes don't fear altitude. At a high village, you're welcomed into a courtyard where frost clings to roof tiles and the smoke of oakwood fires curls skyward. Ongi rest half buried against walls, swaddled in straw mats like sleeping infants. The villagers explain, up here winters are severe, so jars are tucked in straw and soil to shield them from freezing nights. What would crack and spoil on open plains survives when swaddled like a child. The trick is ancient insulation, simple, practical, and quietly elegant. The air itself alters fermentation. You taste a ladleful of rice brew from one jar, sharper, cleaner, with a mountain clarity that reminds you of snowmelt. Locals swear the thin air makes it lighter on the tongue, though modern scholars argue it's temperature, not altitude, that slows microbial pace. Still, belief shapes perception, and the bowl in your hand indeed feels bright, as if thinner skies had leached heaviness from the drink. The villagers keep winter rituals bound to these jars. On the solstice, they place them in a circle, sprinkling pine needles and chanting short blessings. The jars breathe with us, says an elder, tapping the clay. She explains that the mountains echo sound differently. A chant directed at a jar is not lost in air but rebounds, amplifying the intention. You kneel, touch the cool clay, and feel oddly included in a centuries-old conversation between human voice and vessel wall. Children giggle and tug you to another courtyard where a large jar is split. A long crack runs its side, stitched crudely with iron staples. They call it the survivor. Each winter, they say one jar breaks from frost. Rather than discard it, they bind it and use it for drying herbs, keeping it in circulation like a scarred elder. You admire how even broken clay can still belong to the cycle, repurposed instead of discarded. At night the sky turns vast, and the Milky Way hangs like spilled grain. You sit with families around a brazier, sipping fermented millet drink ladled from steaming jars. The brew here tastes of roasted grain and pine smoke, sharper than sea jars, steadier than temple jars. The villagers say it teaches patience, slow to ferment, slow to drink. As they sip, they tell stories of wolves circling at night, of ancestors who carried jars up cliffs in woven cradles, never spilling a drop because ferment feeds the soul when meat is gone. One farmer invites you to taste a rare winter specialty: rice mixed with wild juniper berries, fermented in a jar buried beneath snow. He unearths it with care, wiping frost off the lid. The flavor startles, citrus bright, resinous, astringent, warming. It is winter distilled, survival transformed into delight. Scholars debate whether mountain herbs altered not only taste but local immunity, offering small medicinal benefits. To the villagers, no debate is needed. They drink because it makes cold nights bearable and spirits less heavy. Before leaving, you wander to a cliffside shrine where a single jar stands exposed, rim lined with melted snow. Locals explain that no one drinks from it. It is an offering, a gift to mountain spirits, replenished each spring. They believe the jar prevents landslides and avalanches, a small bargain with forces larger than any farmer. You realize jars in every environment, sea, plains, mountain, become mediators, bridging humans with nature's unpredictable hand. When you descend the mountain path, you carry not just flavor but an impression. Fermentation is not simply chemistry. It is negotiation between cold and warmth, scarcity and abundance, humans and landscape. Clay jars, in their silent sturdiness, have become the negotiator's vessels. You think of the cracked jar bound with iron, the buried jar wrapped in snow, the offering jar left for spirits, and you understand that mountain air writes its own chapter in the long story of grain becoming memory. The mountain trail unwinds beneath your feet, and the air grows thicker, warmer, until the scent of pine smoke fades into the softer smell of fertile soil and damp reeds. Soon you're walking across a plain, a wide quilt of barley fields stretching toward the horizon. Here the land lies low and steady, a perfect canvas for grain, and the rhythm of fermentation follows the rhythm of farming itself. Season after season, sowing and brewing, harvesting and pouring. Farmers greet you with clay-brown hands, leading you toward rows of ongi sunk into the earth, half hidden among reed fences. Unlike the mountain jars wrapped against frost, these are open to sunlight, lids tilted to catch the warmth. A farmer explains, patting one jar, that the plain drinks the sun and the jar drinks the plain. You taste what he means in a ladleful. This drink is golden, warmer on the tongue, touched by the sweetness of barley and the generosity of flat land. Mainstream history records barley and millet brews as staples here, lighter than rice-based varieties, but easier to produce in bulk. These plainer drinks rarely reach the palaces, but they were the lifeblood of farm communities, fueling labor as much as satisfying thirst. And here's the quirky tidbit. Travelers wrote of shepherds who used barley beer not only to drink, but to soften leather sandals. Imagine stepping all day in barley-soaked shoes. You'd either be miserably sticky or strangely comfortable. Historians still argue whether such accounts were exaggerated travelers' tales or fragments of truth about multipurpose fermentation. You watch as families gather for evening meals, pouring bowls not from delicate ladles, but from wide, dented gourds. Children sip without hesitation, elderly drinkers pace themselves, and laborers gulp greedily. No ceremony lingers here, just utility, just companionship. Someone shoves a bowl into your hands, and you realize this drink belongs less to ritual than to routine. It's like their bread, their water, their evening song. One elder recalls how, in years of famine, they stretched jars by mixing roots or acorns into the mash. It was bitter, yes, she laughs, but bitter fills you better than nothing. You taste her words in the current bowl, slightly nutty, slightly earthy, and wonder how much desperation and ingenuity flavored the drinks of the past. The elder shrugs. You brew what the land gives. The jar only listens. As dusk spreads, music rises, simple flutes and drums, accompanied by stomping feet. Farmers dance in a circle, bowls sloshing, barley drinks spilling over wrists and sleeves. They laugh at the mess, unconcerned, because tomorrow's sun will dry it and another jar waits to be opened. You join in, your bowl shaking with each step, until you feel the same careless joy, the kind that makes plain land extraordinary. Nearby, you see a line of carts piled with sealed jars ready for trade. The plains produce more than they consume, so fermentation here becomes not only sustenance but commerce. Barley jars roll toward markets, temples, even coastal ports. Yet farmers know which jars to sell and which to keep. The best batches remain close, guarded for family or festival, while the rest travel outward, carrying whispers of the plain in every sip. Before you leave, one farmer beckons you to the edge of the field. He uncovers a jar half buried in a ridge, filled with brew left to sour intentionally. This field vinegar, he explains, is used to pickle radishes and cabbage, preserving vegetables through lean months. Fermentation here doesn't end in drink alone. It spirals outward, feeding preservation, flavor, and medicine. You taste a drop, puckering at the tang, and understand how even waste becomes resource. The plain darkens into night, fireflies blinking among barley heads, and you lie back in the grass, warmed by barley's quiet gift. Up above, stars scatter across the sky, steady and predictable, like the land beneath. You realize the plains teach a different lesson than mountains or seas: constancy. Fermentation here doesn't strive for glory or mysticism. It simply persists, cycle after cycle, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The steady plains slip away behind you, and soon the path begins to soften under your sandals. The ground grows damp, reeds crowd your ankles, and the sound of trickling water turns into the hum of wetlands alive with frogs. Here, the air is heavy with moisture, and jars rest not on dry stone or warm soil, but on raised wooden platforms above the marsh. The people of the wetlands tell you plainly, if the jar sits on the ground, the swamp swallows it. You climb onto one of these platforms, planks creaking, and see rows of ongi perched like watchful sentinels above pools of water. The villagers smile, proud of their craft. The humidity is relentless here, but instead of ruining the brew, it shapes it. When you sip, the drink is softer, more mellow, with a slightly musty undertone, as though the swamp itself whispered into the grains. They call it the taste of fog, a phrase you roll around your tongue and find oddly fitting. Mainstream history notes that lowland marshes were notorious for disease, yet they also produced resilient brewers. Fermented drinks here were sometimes used as safer alternatives to stagnant water, the alcohol killing harmful microbes. The quirky tidbit? Travelers once recorded swamp dwellers using marsh gas to light small flames during festivals, pairing jars of brew with dancing blue fire. Imagine drinking by lanterns made not of wax but of swamp burps. It's as eerie as it is ingenious. Historians still argue whether this was exaggeration or a fleeting local trick now lost. But the image alone clings in your mind. You wander deeper into the wetlands, where villagers show you another adaptation. Jars sealed tighter than usual, lids pressed with clay, and reeds to keep the swamp insects at bay. Fermentation here is a battle with the environment, every lid a defense against intruding flies. Yet inside those jars, the drink thrives, more pungent than plainland brews, thicker than mountain sips. Some bowls smell faintly of lotus root, others of algae-covered stone, but each carries its own whisper of marsh. At night, villagers sit on stilts above black water, bowls in hand. They laugh louder than plainsfolk, perhaps to scare away the silence of the swamp. You sit among them, tasting brew sweetened with honey, a rare treat in these damp lands. The honey tames the mustiness, adding brightness, and you find yourself imagining how many times villagers tinkered with recipes, learning by failure until even the swamp's breath could be bottled. One elder points to a jar set apart, covered with a thatched roof. This one, she says, is never drunk. Instead, it is left for spirits of the water, offerings made so floods do not rise. You recall the mountain jars given to prevent avalanches and realize that everywhere, people feed the unseen with fermented gifts. The swamp jar sits quietly, bubbles rising inside as if even the spirits thirst. Later, as mist coils above the reeds, you feel the swamp shift around you. Frogs croak, water laps against stilts, and jars breathe through their clay pores. You take one last sip before sleep, the marsh flavor clinging like a fog that refuses to lift. And you sense that fermentation here is less about pleasure than survival. Finding a way to drink safely, to preserve in dampness, to live where others might flee. When morning comes, the mist burns away, and you step off the platforms, boots squelching in mud. Ahead, the land rises again, drier, firmer, leading toward valleys where deer wander, and farmers speak of land spirits, who accept jars as gifts not to prevent floods or frost, but to guard everyday fortune. You smile, realizing your journey will now carry you into superstition's embrace, where every jar isn't just for drinking, it's for bargaining with luck itself. The wetlands fade into firmer ground, and you wander into valleys dotted with stone shrines, little stacks of rocks draped in ribbons and offerings. The air smells less of swamp and more of tilled soil, of hearth smoke curling from low-roofed homes. Here, people believe every bend of land holds a spirit, guardian presences who must be honored if harvests are to thrive. And of course, the spirits drink. You follow a path lined with jars set near crossroads, each with a ladle resting across its rim. Farmers stop to pour a splash as they pass, muttering quick prayers under their breath. The liquid isn't wasted, they explain, because spirits sip through vapor, not through gulps. You smile at the thought, phantoms tipsy on steam. Mainstream records mention how fermented drinks became central to agrarian rituals, poured at field edges before sowing and harvesting. These offerings were not grand banquets, but steady little gestures, everyday diplomacy with the unseen. The quirky tidbit? Some old sayings warned that if you forgot to share your brew with the land spirits, your jars at home would sour overnight in revenge. Historians still argue whether this belief was metaphorical, a reminder not to be stingy, or whether people truly feared spirits sneaking into kitchens to curdle mash. In one village, you watch families gather at dusk to set jars before a cairn. A woman sprinkles grain flour around the base, drawing a circle of protection, while her son lifts the lid so the aroma wafts upward. You breathe it in, warm and yeasty, with the grassy note of millet. The valley air carries it farther, as though the spirits themselves are inhaling. Later, you're invited into a home where a jar rests beside the hearth, decorated with carved sticks and a few bird feathers. This is for the household guardian, the host explains. She tastes before we do. He pours a small bowl and sets it by the jar, then gestures for you to drink from another. You sip. It's tart, lightly fizzy, with a clean finish. The thought occurs, are you sharing a table with invisible guests? The family acts as if yes. Children play a game outside, pretending to be spirits who demand drinks, chasing each other with bowls of water. Their laughter rings against stone walls, but beneath it you sense the weight of tradition. Teach children that spirits crave respect, and the cycle of offering continues unbroken. As night falls, villagers gather around a bonfire, each holding a bowl. They raise their drinks not to each other, but to the dark ridges looming above. A hush spreads, broken only by the crackle of flame and the distant rustle of deer in the brush. You raise your bowl, too, and in that silence you almost believe the land itself is raising one back. The brew tastes stronger in this valley, darker, brewed longer, perhaps intentionally left to deepen. It coats your throat with warmth, carrying notes of roasted grain and faint bitterness. One elder leans close and whispers, "Spirits like it bitter. Sweet is for humans, bitter is for gods." You wonder if bitterness is indeed a divine language, or if people simply learn to mask flaws by calling them sacred. Historians still argue whether these spirit offerings were born from animism, shamanism, or practical farming rituals that acquired mysticism over time. But to the villagers, the debate is irrelevant. They drink, they pour, they whisper. The land drinks back, or so they trust. When you leave the valley, jars glimmer faintly in moonlight at each path's fork, silent companions for travelers and spirits alike. And as the road bends upward again, you sense that the next jars you encounter will not rest at field shrines, but in darker, more intimate spaces, places where drink slips from ritual into desire. where fermentation becomes a curtain lifted in the hush of night. You wake with the memory of salt and smoke on your tongue, and keep walking until the path funnels you into a narrow lane lined with small shops that smell of wood smoke, drying fruit, and something almost barn-like, an aroma that promises surprises. Lamps hang low. A tinkling bell announces each customer. Behind a low counter, an old brewer smiles and gestures to a display of tiny bowls, each holding a different shade of cloudy liquid. Pale honey moss green, amber that catches the lamp like a trapped sunset, and one so dark you can't tell if it's meant to be drink or a dare. This is the alley of experiments, the street where taste self becomes alchemy, and you are invited to become a willing, curious test subject. Mainstream accounts tell you that Korean brewers historically added a huge range of local ingredients to their mashes: pine needles, various fruits, sea salt, medicinal roots, even fish sauces, because the point was not purity but utility in place. You learn that this is not sloppy improvisation but a practiced language of flavor. Each addition signals a season, a place, or a purpose. Pine needles suggest mountain air, persimmon speaks of autumn, and salted fish carries a coastal fingerprint. But the alley's true gift is how those fingerprints interact. How acid meets resin, how sweetness flirts with umami, how a jar's microbiome translates landscape into sip. The first bowl the brewer presses into your hand holds something green and bright. You lift it, the aroma lifting with it, a resinous, almost citrusy whiff that smells like crushed pine boughs after rain. He grins and says simply, "Pine." You sip, and the flavor unfurls in your mouth like a memory. Resin and lemon pith, then a rounded grain sweetness that anchors the edge. It's a little like a gin's idea of a rice wine, but softer, less botanical aggression, more suggestion than pronouncement. The brewer explains that pine needles were sometimes used to add antiseptic qualities and astringency. They also drove aroma into places where simple rice couldn't reach. The quirky bit? Some villagers believed storing a jar near a potted pine tree made the brew cleaner, as if the tree itself lent moral clarity to the alcohol. Historians still argue whether pine's role was primarily medicinal, symbolic, or simply aesthetic. You move on, because each bowl is a new lesson. A small vendor offers you a cup dark with dried fruit, persimmon, candied and softened until it bleeds into the mash. The flavor is autumn pressed into liquid, sun-warmed sugar softened by tannin, an almost leathery sweetness offset by a thin acidity that keeps the cup from tipping into cloying. Persimmons were prized because they concentrated seasons into sugar. When folded into fermentation, they built body and an old-time richness that felt like a story told slowly. The fringe detail? Some brewers fermented whole persimmons until they literally burst and re-fermented the syrup, an extreme method thought to summon abundance. Historians still argue whether that practice was widespread or just a ritual indulgence in specific regions. Then you're handed a bowl that makes you blink before you taste. A blank, slightly briny scent, an uncanny depth. It turns out the jar held a small portion of salted fish paste, gyokgul, used sparingly to give the brew a savory backbone. The first swallow startles with umami, a tide of flavor that suggests ocean floors and sun-dried nets. Your reflex is to recoil, but your brain recalibrates. Salted fish, when balanced, adds complexity the way a Parmesan rind seasons a soup. The quirky detail here is almost brazen. Coastal brewers sometimes dropped a spoonful of fish guts into a ferment to encourage certain bacteria, and in trade ports you'd find jars that smelled like brine and kiln smoke. Inland palates might have considered them uncouth. Historians still argue whether such additions were born of necessity. Preserving fish was a practical priority, or of culinary curiosity. You notice a pattern. Every addition nudges the microbiology inside the jar 1 degree left or right. Pine's acids favor certain lactobacilli. Persimmon sugars feed yeasts differently. Salt selects for halo-tolerant communities. The brewer, who has watched jars for decades, speaks like a conductor explaining an orchestra. He taps the rim, tells you which jar wants heat and which wants cool, which will thicken into porridge by morning, and which will stay drinkable. Taste is negotiation. he murmurs, and you believe him because the jars themselves answer, burbling softly like small, patient mouths. The alley is a classroom for odd pairings. A woman on the corner mixes jujube and ginger into a small cask, sweet, warming, with a fibrous bite that you want to chew rather than swallow. Elsewhere, a youth experiments with pine needle and kelp, an attempt to translate mountain and sea into one bowl. You taste both offerings. The jujube ginger cup comforts. The pine kelp cup unsettles you in a delicious way, as if two geographies argued and then made up. People around you pipe up with local legends. Pine kelp was once brewed to honor a sea spirit who married a mountain guardian. If the brew turned cloudy, the lovers would walk away content. Whether such tales are metaphor or memory, they help the community keep its recipes alive. About 100 sips in, figuratively, because you're prudent, you notice a modern aside creep into your thoughts. Craft bartenders and experimental chefs in cities now pay good money to replicate these forgotten pairings. They age rice in cedar barrels, add smoked kelp to fermentations, or pitch sea-salted koji into batches for that coastal funk. The alley's elder nods, amused and slightly pleased. Tradition is suddenly trendy, and the old jar's lessons seep back into contemporary kitchens, altered but recognizable. You chuckle because it's the same dance you've seen elsewhere on your journey. What once sustained villages becomes the novelty of salons. Still, the question hangs. Are modern recreations faithful homages or theatrical pastiche? Historians and chefs still argue. Back in the lane, a brewer draws a cup flavored with flowers, chrysanthemum and magnolia petals steeped long during fermentation. It's floral without perfume, a gentle bouquet that lifts the grain's hum. Petals, she says, were sometimes added for scent, but also because they carried pollens and microflora from orchards, surrogates of terroir, if you like. A man nearby swears that women used flower ferments in beauty regimens, bathing with diluted brew to soften skin. You file that under quirky, but you don't dismiss it. People have always mixed cosmetic and culinary worlds. Not all experiments are pleasing. A jar shaded by garlic and fermented fish gives a sharp, almost aggressive bite that some love and others avoid. A schoolmaster who listens to your questions warns that stubborn experiments sometimes create off flavors and sickness. There is a line between creative fermentation and dangerous contamination. The artisanal impulse is bound to curiosity, but prudence lives beside it in kitchens where entire families depend on the jar's steadiness. You pause and remember a jar you saw months ago, an old court brew spiked with soft petals and gold leaf, meant to dazzle. Another in a temple, bitter with herbaceous resolve. Those memories come back now because here, in the lane, such extremes jostle together. See guts and chrysanthemum, pine and persimmon, honey and juniper. You're struck again by a simple truth you've encountered before. Flavor in these ferments is geography made liquid, a map you can drink. Each addition is a place, a season, a relationship. As night deepens, the lantern glow softens, and the lane grows intimate. The elder brewer leans in and offers one last cup. A mix that begins sweet, goes leathery with dried persimmon, slips into a pine resin finish, and then, briefly, delivers a savory whisper that might be sea or might be smoke. It's audacious, and your palate keeps discovering new corners hours later. You ask how he decides what combinations to try. He smiles, taps the jar, and says, "Because the world is loud and the jars are patient." You take your final sip slowly. The alley hums with voices, neighbors trading tips, children mimicking older hands by tapping lids. Somewhere, someone hums a tune you heard in a temple. In another corner, a sailor's laugh cuts through the night. The jars here are full of experiments, compromises, and bold bets. They teach you that taste is not an isolated preference, but a conversation between landscape, culture, risk, and time. Before you leave, the brewer presses a small vial of liquid into your palm. "Try adding a drop to your tea at dawn," he says. It wakes things up. You tuck it away with the rest of your memories, grateful for the lesson. There's a kind of bravery in trying strange pairings, and a kind of humility in learning when to stop. Outside, the lane opens onto the wider road you know. onto courts, temples, jars in kitchens, and the long night of history that still simmers in clay. You wake with the impression that some recipes slipped away not because they were trivial, but because they were too fragile to endure time's rough handling. Picture yourself in a quiet Korean village centuries ago, watching a grandmother tilt her clay jar toward the light and mutter a rhyme that only she remembers. That rhyme, you realize, is part of the recipe because she sings it when she stirs the mixture, and maybe the rhythm dictates how long she circles the spoon. Without her voice, the brew is incomplete. Fast forward to today, and no written record captures that melody. The drink becomes a ghost, existing only in half-remembered lullabies or half-joking anecdotes passed around at harvest feasts. One mainstream fact anchors you here. Korean culinary records note dozens of traditional ferments, but modern scholars agree many were never systematically written down, existing solely in oral transmission. Without recipes carved into bamboo slips or copied into ledgers, the drinks could vanish in a single generation. And yet the quirky detail emerges. In some regions, children were taught the flavor of a brew before they even learned their letters, tasting a spoonful at family gatherings and being told, "Remember this, it's your grandmother's." That taste served as memory's archive, fragile as the child's palate. You probably find yourself whispering, couldn't they have just written it down? But historians still argue whether writing alone would have preserved the essence. After all, fermentation is alive. One jar in a humid valley tastes utterly different from a jar on a windy hilltop. Even if the measurements survive, the song of the yeast and the microclimate's breath may not. Some claim that the ghost recipes aren't truly lost. They live on in mutated descendants, hiding inside today's macchiali or obscure village brews that nobody markets. Others insist they are gone forever, like extinct bird calls swallowed by silence. As you drift deeper, you imagine ghostly brewers walking beside you, carrying bowls filled with drinks you can never taste. They tilt them toward you, vapor curling upward, and the scent is just out of reach, like smelling rain on dry pavement, but never seeing the storm. You reach, but the liquid dissolves into mist. That's the price of forgetting. Still, you find comfort in the fact that memory has many disguises. Even if the recipes disappeared, the lullabies survived. Grandmothers still hum while rocking infants, and some of those notes once belonged to the rhythm of stirring jars. You picture an elderly woman, eyes half closed, crooning to a child while her hands trace invisible circles in the air, as if stirring something that no longer exists. That phantom gesture keeps the ghost recipes hovering in the background, like a benevolent haunting. Modern archivists occasionally stumble upon dusty manuscripts with half-legible notes, lists of herbs, sketches of brewing jars, hints of proportions. They argue over what the scribbles mean, whether add 3 branches referred to weight, or simply to whatever twigs happen to be nearby. Even with such fragments, no laboratory can resurrect the exact flavor. Yet the search itself feels sacred, like unrolling a treasure map where X marks nothing tangible, but still draws you deeper into mystery. You realize your own role in this long chain of almost memory, listening, imagining, then carrying forward the whisper. Each time you picture a forgotten ferment, it lingers a little longer, refusing to vanish entirely. Ghost recipes, in that sense, never die. They linger as shadows in imagination, which might be the most potent fermentation of all. You sit now at a long wooden table polished smooth by generations of elbows, its surface scattered with scrolls, chipped bowls, and a few half-filled jars. The air buzzes faintly with the tension of negotiation, though no one dares raise their voice too high. This isn't just a dinner, it's diplomacy. In old Korea, fermented drinks weren't only fuel for farmers or offerings to spirits. They were bargaining chips, carefully poured into porcelain cups when alliances were tested. You lift one such cup in your imagination, the cloudy liquid trembling just slightly, and wonder if a treaty might live or die based on its taste. One solid historical fact frames this scene. Records from the Goryeo and Joseon courts show that alcohol was an expected part of diplomatic receptions. Envoys from China, Japan, and even nomadic groups often encountered bowls of local ferments offered as gestures of goodwill. Refusing could be taken as an insult. Accepting meant you committed, at least symbolically, to mutual trust. And yet, here's the quirky twist. Some accounts mention that these drinks were so strong, or so unusual in flavor, that foreign dignitaries would grimace politely while drinking. Imagine a stiff-backed envoy from the Ming court taking a cautious sip of ginseng-soaked brew, nodding solemnly, while his stomach plotted rebellion. You probably sense the precariousness of this moment. Historians still argue whether certain broken alliances were caused by clashing politics or clashing palates. Did the salty, fish-scented ferments, sometimes offered on coastal tables, ruin more than one negotiation? Or was that just a scapegoat, an easy way to blame fermented oddities for human stubbornness? Some letters from foreign envoys suggest that hospitality was generous, but the taste was most peculiar, which you can translate in your head as "never again, please." Still, you lean in closer and notice how Koreans themselves viewed the act of sharing a cup. The pouring hand always tilted slightly downward, body bowed forward in respect. The guest mirrored this courtesy, turning his head away as he swallowed. These rituals weren't just manners, they were choreography, making drinking itself a kind of stage play. On that stage, alliances were written not with ink but with foam. Sometimes, the stakes were deadly serious. Picture two generals meeting on the eve of truce, each waiting for the other to drink first, eyes locked like duelists. One sip too slow, and suspicion thickens like sour mash. One sip too eager, and you look desperate. You find yourself holding your breath at this imagined table, realizing you too might give yourself away. But just as often, fermented diplomacy softened into laughter. The strong brews loosened tongues, and stern envoys sometimes ended up singing foreign songs by lantern light, their polished hats askew. That image lingers with you. The high drama of empire dissolving into slurred harmony, where the language barrier is bridged not by interpreters, but by yeast. You think of your own life, how often small shared rituals, like splitting a beer or clinking coffee mugs, have softened conversations more than any well-planned argument. So tonight, in your drifting mind, fermented diplomacy is not some dusty chapter of treaties and power plays. It is a reminder that people have always relied on shared tastes to build trust, even if the flavors sting or surprise. You sip, you grimace, you laugh, you survive the awkwardness, and somehow the world tilts a little closer toward peace. Dusk loosens the day from your shoulders like an old sash, and you find yourself back among the fields where you began. The air tastes of worked soil and the faint sweetness of trampled grain. As tools are stacked and animals led to their stalls, people gather in small clusters on low benches and earthen thresholds. The jars you passed earlier, silent, patient during the noon hours, are now the evening's pulsing centers. A neighbor slides a shallow wooden bowl into your hands without ceremony. Taking it is already a kind of ritual, a nonverbal passing of trust that says, "We fed the land today, now we feed ourselves." There is a blunt, practical truth scholars agree on. Everyday ferments such as macchiali, siki, and millet beers were staple sources of sustenance for agrarian communities. They deliver calories, replenish energy after work, and offer a low level of alcohol that eases aching muscles and softens the chill. For many households, a bowl at dusk is literally a second meal. Liquid bread when fuel or time to cook is scarce. You feel that practicality when the warm, cloudy liquid settles in your belly. It is comfort measured by necessity, not decoration. You notice a small, charming custom right away. In some villages, people leave the last inch of a jar untouched, out of deference to the vessel or to household spirits. The next morning, that thin film is scraped and boiled into porridge for chickens or stirred into the next batch. Nothing is simply discarded. Seeing a grandmother scrape that rim with a worn spoon, soft humming, practiced pull, teaches you how thrift and belief braid together. Historians still argue whether such practices were primarily pragmatic economy dressed as superstition or genuinely animist devotion wrapped in thrift. You raise the bowl and sip. The texture is slightly gritty, sour with a soft lactic tang, and there's a faint fizz that makes your teeth feel alive. Conversation around you loosens in gentle stages. A chuckle, then a story, then a confession so ordinary it feels like weather. A neighbor recounts the morning's misadventure, an ox refusing the yoke, and the bowl in your lap steadies you like a shared exhale. Children toddle with watered-down cups, practicing the rhythm of passing bowls, the etiquette they will carry into adulthood. Never gulp, never lift your cup above an elder's, never turn away mid-toast. The social mechanics are plain and practical. A tense quarrel over a borrowed plow is often diffused by handing over a jar and drinking together. The physical circulation of the bowl breaks the momentum of anger. You hear small, repeated stories of a bridegroom cooled by a grandmother's gentle pour, of a stubborn landlord softened by a long, steady pass of the jar. And you begin to understand how fermentation functions as social currency. Calories that lubricate cooperation and ritualized sharing that obliges reciprocity. Some historians celebrate these tales as evidence of communal resilience. Others caution against idealizing poverty. Historians still argue whether everyday drinking primarily strengthens social bonds or masks deeper structural pressures. There is, too, a medicinal thread woven through ordinary cups. Fingers dab liquid on scraped knees. The elderly sip warm bowls for upset stomachs. Some of this is placebo and some practical. Low concentrations of alcohol and acidity can inhibit certain microbes. Modern research even finds probiotic bacteria in traditional ferments, which suggests real gut benefits for populations without refrigeration. Whether every folk remedy had a biochemical basis or acted mainly through belief, the sense is the same. You drink, you trust, and the community reinforces both actions. Not all scenes are warm. You spot a man who drinks nightly beyond the household norm. His voice is bright when the bowl is near and brittle when it's not. Communities have social tools to manage such excesses. Elders might withhold the reserved batch, relatives stage gentle interventions, or labor tasks are reassigned until the behavior corrects. At times enforcement is awkward and compassionate, at times it is blunt. The jars themselves become instruments of social regulation as much as nourishment. Historians still argue how effectively traditional societies managed dependency without modern institutions. The household craft is visible in every gesture. Morning chores, hulling, steaming, pounding, feed into afternoon inoculation with Nuric. The jar then sleeps through heat and night cold until the taste matures. In many villages, women are the archivists of these processes, judging a batch with a single look and deciding whether to dilute, keep, or convert lees into vinegar. Their tacit knowledge, when to skim froth, when to stir gently, how to judge by scent, sits at the heart of domestic fermentation, a quiet expertise rarely written but deeply felt. Economics thread through the cups you pass. A good harvest yields jars for both home and market. A poor season shrinks bowls and encourages creative stretching, roots, acorns, or barley mixed into mash. Lees get repurposed for pickling radish or boosting porridge. Nothing in this system is purely waste. You overhear a farmer shrug and say, "We drink what the field gives." And you understand that fermentation is a flexible technology for scarcity, turning surplus into storable nourishment and turning thin years into something bearable. Evenings brim with small dramas that weave community. A tradesman tells how a modest bowl once soothed a quarrel that threatened a partnership. A boy confesses to stealing cider and receives a diluted cup and a stern laugh, not a beating. These moments are social stitches. They can be romanticized, and sometimes they are, but they also show how ordinary acts of sharing, measured, repeated, accountable, build durable cooperation. There are constraints and consequences, yes, but also a steady practice of mutual care enacted through clay and foam. You find echoes of other jars in this domestic cup, the precision from temple brews, the sea's salt sometimes carried inland by trade, the taste of mountain herbs mingling when a neighbor swapped a branch for a favor. The household ferment is porous. It absorbs climate, trade routes, ritual, and memory, and returns them as something palatable to neighbors. A hint of resin, a mineral lift, or a persistent yeast note can all tell you a story if you learn to listen. When your bowl empties, you do not stagger. You feel warm, steady, present. Lids are tightened, cloths drawn, and the jars settle to breathe in the night. Children practice holding cups the old way. 2 hands, eyes down, and you watch the pedagogy of care at work. The jars will murmur through the dark. Tomorrow they will keep the same community fed, laughable grievances soothed, and labor made tolerable. Everyday intoxication here is modest and essential. A slow technology of care that feeds bodies, tempers conversations, and knits people to place. You pause by a fence where 2 women haggle over seed and laugh between sips. A loving scolding ends with a forgiving pour. The evening's smallest acts, the refill slid across the tablecloth, the scolding softened by a bowl, are the stitches that hold villages together. You taste again the last rim of warmth on your lips, a composite of fields, the faint memory of seaborne salt carried by traders, the temple's discipline, and the breath of clay ongi, and you tuck that complex flavor into memory like a map. The ritual repeats, and you, passing through, learn that ordinary intoxication is less about escape and more about exchange, habit, and the quiet maintenance of life. The bowl you hold tonight glows faintly under a flickering bulb. Not torchlight, not lantern light, but the kind of buzz you recognize from convenience stores and late-night diners. What you're sipping is familiar yet altered, cloudy, soft, sweet-sour, the froth clinging to the lip of a plastic cup instead of a clay jar. This is Macchiali, the modern heir to countless lost ferments, and you sense how many ghosts swim in its haze. Here's the reliable historical anchor. Macchiali, as we know it, surged in popularity during the Joseon dynasty, though its roots stretch far deeper, back to earlier rice ferments that blurred the line between food and drink. It was the beverage of farmers and workers, hearty and sustaining, thick enough to replace a meal. Unlike distilled liquors reserved for the elite, this cloudy brew was democratic. An equalizer poured from clay crocks into the calloused hands of the many. Today, it is bottled, pasteurized, and sold under fluorescent lights, yet its DNA still hums with ancient yeast and old rice fields. You catch the quirky note. In the 20th century, some Koreans carried Macchiali in old repurposed gasoline cans to save on container costs. Imagine the confusion. Fuel for tractors and fuel for farmers both sloshing in the same shape of vessel. It's the kind of story that sticks because it sounds like satire, but locals swear it happened, and some still chuckle at the memory. Yet historians still argue whether today's Macchiali is a true descendant or merely a distant cousin. Pasteurization, preservatives, factory-scale Nurek. These are interruptions in the fermentation line, smoothing the rough edges that once made each jar unique. Some insist that commercial Macchiali has drifted too far, a homogenized echo of the village bowl. Others argue that continuity is not about chemical fidelity but cultural rhythm. The act of sharing a cloudy cup after work, the way laughter pools faster when lips are ringed with foam. Your senses tug you through different layers of time. Sip, and you taste more than rice. You taste the communal benches where gossip softened quarrels, the wooden ladles that splashed prayers into jars, the festivals where drums set the pace for bowls passed hand to hand. Even in its bottled form, Macchiali carries residues of ritual, bowing when pouring, offering with 2 hands, averting eyes in respect. That etiquette endures, even when the packaging is shrink wrap instead of clay. You notice how Macchiali travels now. Trendy Seoul cafes serve it in pastel cups with ginger or chestnut infusions. Young couples clink glasses over fusion food, while elders shake their heads at the sweetness, muttering, "Not like the old days." Abroad, hip bars label it Korean rice wine, often mistaking it for sake's cousin rather than its own lineage. You smirk at that mistranslation, like calling your grandmother by the neighbor's name. Close, but not right. Even in your imagination, Macchiali feels heavier in your hand than beer, softer on your tongue than wine. It sits halfway between drink and meal, between past and present. The yeast haze is history itself, millions of tiny cells, alive or dead, layering memory like sediment. You find yourself swirling the cup, as if by stirring you might wake a note of ancient pine, or summon a whisper of forgotten honey wine. What lingers is the tension, modernity's convenience against tradition's stubborn variation. Macchiali is mass-produced and shipped worldwide, yet each gulp insists you remember the clay jars breathing in the earth. It is both compromise and continuity, proof that memory ferments just as rice does, changing form, yet recognizable by taste. You finish your cup with a sigh, cloudy residue clinging to the bottom. Somewhere in that haze, you think are all the recipes you've already met, the honey pots, the temple brews, the lost lullabies, coalescing into a drink people still pour every day. Macchiali is the archive you can actually sip, a museum in motion, fizzing gently on your tongue. You're no longer seated on a wooden bench or under the tiled eaves of a Josian courtyard. Now the setting around you hums neon, glass, and stainless steel. Trendy bartenders, sleeves rolled high, shake copper shakers as though performing a ceremony of their own. They aren't monks, they aren't grandmothers, yet you notice they bow slightly when pouring, as if the memory of respect lingers unconsciously. Tonight's menu lists drinks you recognize in name, but twisted into glittering shapes. Fermented rice fused with lime zest, ginseng floated atop tonic water, persimmon liqueur edged with chili salt. Forgotten ferments of Korea, reborn as nightclub novelties. The historical fact is plain. In the early 21st century, Macchiali experienced a resurgence among younger generations in Korea, rebranded as healthy, artisanal, and proudly traditional. Breweries popped up offering flavored versions, from banana to black bean, drawing in curious crowds. Abroad, the Korean wave of pop culture carried these drinks into bars from New York to Berlin. But the quirky tidbit makes you chuckle. Some bartenders abroad, unfamiliar with the cloudy consistency, tried straining Macchiali clear, removing the very yeast haze that defines its rustic character, then served it like wine. Imagine centuries of Korean grandmothers rolling their eyes in unison. Historians still argue whether this global remixing is preservation or dilution. Is turning a forgotten herbal ferment into a neon-pink cocktail an act of revival, honoring the core idea, or an act of erasure, glossing over subtle textures in favor of spectacle? The debate swirls like shaken foam in a martini glass, unresolved but fascinating. You watch the bartenders move with grace, and you think of the village women tending ongi jars, stirring slowly with wooden paddles. The gestures, though worlds apart, share a rhythm. Both acts transform grain and herb into conversation. Both acts are hospitality disguised as craft. Only the lighting differs. Here LEDs glow where fire once flickered. At your table, someone slides you a drink rimmed with salt and topped with a curl of ginger. The sip is shockingly sweet, almost candy-like, but beneath the sugar you taste the ghost of Nurek. Yeast still whispers from the past, insisting on its presence. You lean back, the music thrumming low, and realize you're participating in the same eternal script. Strangers soften into friends through shared cups, only now the cups sweat condensation instead of clay coolness. Even outside the bar scene, you see echoes of revival. Online recipe forums swap ancient instructions. Homebrewers experiment with herbs forgotten for centuries. Scholars collaborate with chefs to reconstruct half-lost flavors. Sometimes they succeed, and a forgotten brew breathes again. Sometimes the result is barely drinkable, more laboratory accident than tavern delight. And yet, you can't help admiring the effort. Every attempt is a small rebellion against forgetting. The quirky global enthusiasm sometimes turns comedic. In London, a festival once advertised Korean sake, confusing categories entirely but selling out tickets anyway. In Los Angeles, a kombucha brewer mixed Macchiali with hibiscus and marketed it as rice bucha, half tradition, half invention. Purists groan, hipsters cheer, and you sip, shrug, and smile, because fermentation was never about purity, always about adaptation. You glance across the bar, and for a moment, the silhouettes blur. You no longer see bartenders but temple monks, grandmothers, soldiers, farmers, each holding a cup. The centuries overlap, the drinks remix, and you sense the strange truth. the forgotten ferments of Korea were never fully forgotten. They reincarnate with every swirl, every sip, every clink of glasses. Even when the music is electronic instead of drummed, even when the lights are neon instead of fire. The world spins forward, but yeast doesn't care. It bubbles, it ferments, it bridges time without asking permission. And so you drink, and you smile, and you taste both the ancient field and the rooftop bar in one swallow. You walk now along a quiet riverside at night. The water mirrors stars, distant lanterns flicker, and the soft hum of cicadas fills the air. The journey that began in misty mountains, through plains, wetlands, temples, and urban bars, now condenses into this slow, reflective pace. Each step feels weighted with memory, every breath infused with scents of yeast, grain, honey, and pine. Here, at the edge of river and night, you realize the journey of forgotten Korean ferments has never really been about consumption alone. It has been about connection, to land, to community, to the invisible threads of history that taste like mud, smoke, and sweet rice. Mainstream history reminds us that Korea's fermented beverages were woven into the daily lives of people across all classes. Peasants relied on them for nourishment, warriors for stamina, scholars for focus, and royals for ceremony. Each jar was a vessel of culture, a microcosm of geography and season, each sip a silent chronicle. Yet the quirky detail persists. Travelers occasionally noted villagers sleeping near their fermenting jars during cold nights, believing the jar's warmth, or perhaps their scent, protected against bad dreams. Historians still argue whether this was ritual, superstition, or simple comfort in winter chill. You pause beside an old, moss-covered stone bridge and think about the jars you've seen in clay, wood, or even repurposed metal. Each one has spoken a dialect of flavor: mountain pine, swamp brine, persimmon sweetness, barley richness, conveying stories without words. Some flavors disappeared when the song of the jar was forgotten. Some evolved into modern macchiali, flavored variants, or distilled liqueurs. The line between lost and transformed blurs, and you realize that fermentation, like memory, adapts while retaining its essence. You remember distant festivals, the playful children, the quiet elders, the solemn pouring for spirits, the bustling modern bars, the laboratory recreations, all moments stitched together by the simple, persistent act of letting grains, water, and time converse. Even ghost recipes left no written record. They exist in taste, gesture, and story. You feel their presence now as you hold a small cup in your hand, the liquid warm, clouded, alive with centuries of trial, celebration, and adaptation. Historians still debate the influence of specific regional microbes, the precision of ancient brewing methods, and the true flavors lost to time. But you know what matters. Each cup, each taste, is an echo, a bridge across centuries, a reminder that culture can ferment and travel, survive and transform, even when nearly forgotten. You sip slowly, letting the warmth seep into your chest, the river reflecting both stars and memory, and you sense that the jars, the land, and the people are all intertwined, alive in the act of sharing. As night deepens, you hear only the soft lap of water, the distant call of a night bird, and the quiet gurgle of your own thoughts. In this suspended moment, you recognize that fermentation was never only chemical. It was narrative, ritual, and intimate care. It persisted because people needed it to connect, to nourish, to celebrate, to console, to negotiate, and above all, to remember. You carry this truth with a gentle reverence, understanding that in every sip of modern macchiali, in every revived flavor, and in every whispered memory, the past still tastes remarkably alive. The night stretches and softens, and you feel your body sinking deeper into its own quiet rhythm. The river moves slowly, reflecting the stars in a wavering shimmer, and you sense the vastness of time rolling past your feet. Every jar you imagined, every sip you savored, and every melody whispered over fermenting grains begins to dissolve gently into your mind's background hum. You breathe slowly, inhaling the faint, comforting aromas of rice, honey, pine, and earth, and you let them blend into a single, sustaining warmth. History is no longer a series of dates and records, but a texture of daily life, the ebb and flow of jars, the hands that stirred them, the voices that sang over them, the rituals both sacred and playful that threaded human hearts together. Forgotten recipes hover as ghosts you can taste, modern brews hum their distant echoes, and everywhere you look, fermentation pulses quietly, patiently, like a heartbeat. The world outside, the city, the modern bustle, the noise of your own day, feels distant. Your mind drifts toward the simple truth. Human creativity, curiosity, and care have always found a way to leave traces. Even when flavors fade, even when jars break, even when lullabies are whispered only once, something remains. Something that is both ephemeral and enduring. Something that you can hold in your memory, in your imagination, in the slow, deliberate act of sipping and remembering. So let yourself drift with the gentle currents of history. Let your thoughts waver like reeds in a river, and know that fermentation, like life itself, is cyclical, persistent, and quietly miraculous. Carry the warmth of those jars, the laughter of villagers, and the whisper of forgotten recipes with you, like a soft echo that will linger until morning. Sleep now, softly, and let these flavors and stories weave into your dreams.